welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens and this is English Nerd. Today I have a special treat for you because I am doing a collaboration with Marisa Mohi over on her channel, so I will give you all the information linked down below. Together we have 10 different common writing mistakes that we see since we both teach writing at different levels. So I'll be giving 5 and Marisa will be giving 5, and you should definitely check out her side of the video because if you haven't seen her channel yet, she has really great AuthorTube related advice. She focuses on productivity and just puts out a ton of great content. So definitely encourage you to go check her out. Okay, here are the 5 most common writing mistakes that I tend to see as a teacher of writing. Now I'm speaking about fiction writing here, just to be perfectly clear. I know my channel does both academic, analytical style writing and fiction. Most of these can actually apply to both, but there are some that are more specific to fiction. So here we go, in no particular order. We have number 1. Meaningless dialogue. This one obviously only pertains to fiction because you really don't see dialogue, you see quotations in essays. So what do I mean by meaningless dialogue? Meaningless dialogue is, "Hi Susan, how are you? Joe, it's so good to see you. What have you been up to? Oh, nothing." Just that filler dialogue that doesn't reveal character, it doesn't further the plot, it doesn't discuss the themes. There's just nothing really to it. It's just, I get the sense anyway that my students, when they're not quite sure what to write next, will just have kind of a generic conversation to keep things going. But that is not at all engaging, and it doesn't provide us with any new information whatsoever. Now, does every conversation in a piece need to be laser focused to the plot? No, because these people are people. They can talk about other things, but there should be a connection to helping us understand them as people or their relationships or something that underlies every conversation. Otherwise, why did you put this in when it's just kind of generic and meaningless? So that is one of the major things that I see. Number 2 is using uninteresting verbs. One of the quickest ways to make your writing more interesting, believe it or not, is to use more interesting verbs than just is, was, were. It was a lovely day. He was in his house. You know, just those boring, generic kinds of verbs when you could use verbs that are much more descriptive instead of, and my go-to example, I might have put this in another video. If I have, I'm sorry. But my go-to example when I'm teaching this is the snake was on the porch. It's not an incorrect sentence, it's just kind of boring. But you could say the snake coiled on the porch, and now you can see the snake much more clearly. You could say it slithered on the porch. You could say it sunned itself on the porch. Suddenly you get a much more dynamic picture of what's going on rather than just using those really generic verbs. So a quick way to make your writing much more interesting, much more engaging, to draw the reader along is to use more interesting verbs. So that is tip number 2. Tip number 3, I don't see constantly, this isn't a problem with everybody, but I see a lot of telling and not showing. I know this is one of those pieces of writing advice that has been around AuthorTube and the writing community for many years. You want to show and not tell. But specifically, I see this with if something looks a certain way, it is this way. I don't get a full description of what that looks like or what that means. You know, their clothing looked old. Okay, well, what did it look like? Show it to me. Or she was nervous before she went on stage. That's fine, but show me a little bit of that in the way that she talks or interacts or something, in addition to just telling me what's going on. If you just tell a story, it can be okay, but if you show a story, if you present it in a way that is engrossing and, what's the word I'm looking for? Not encompassing, but immersive. That's the word I'm looking for. If you present it in a way that's immersive, suddenly you bring your fiction writing to just, telling a fairy tale or telling a story to your friends to actually being a great writer of fiction. So as much as you can, show, don't tell. Some things you have to tell, I get that. In fact, one of the criticisms that I got on my own book was that I needed to tell a little bit more and show a little bit less so that people felt more oriented in the world. But more often with my students, I tend to see a lot more telling than showing. Number 4, I don't know what the deal is. I didn't see this problem as often when I first started teaching years ago, but I definitely have seen it in the last few years, and that is flip-flopping tenses. So it is shocking the number of people who flip-flop between present and past tense. Sometimes they're the perfect tenses spread out among there too, which is have, been, had, seen. If you have the have or had or will have, those are perfect tenses. Anyway, flip-flopping between present and past tense. Now, in a first draft, it's really not that big of a deal to change between present and past tense, but when you're editing, you have to pick a side. You must. And if you pick a side early and you're intentional about it, you're going to save yourself a whole lot of heartache when you're going through and you're making all those verbs present tense or you're making all those verbs past tense. Personally, I prefer past tense, but I know that a lot of young adult fiction in particular tends to go with present tense, and so if my students are primarily young adult readers, that's what they're consuming, then they will often default to present tense, but then they also have past tense stuff for their school reading, so then they'll flip-flop back. It's just a mess. So be aware. If this is an issue that you have, just intentionally choose one or the other. Otherwise, it just gets absolutely crazy. I've seen in one sentence tenses flip-flopping all over the place, so cut that out. That's terrible. And then number 5, I think this is possibly the most helpful piece of advice that I could give to a young writer, and something that I needed to hear when I was a teenager who was writing, but I wouldn't have heard it. I wasn't in the right headspace, but I have since seen the light, and it's made a world. Like, I can't even describe how much of a difference it's made in my writing life. It is the difference between having a writing life and not having a writing life for me. It was the difference between being able to publish a book, which comes out in July, and not publishing a book. And it is this, so I guess I have saved the best for last. The final mistake that I see is not editing fiction for content, but just proofreading. So often my students will, they'll glance over their fiction work or their more creative work. They'll check for spelling and things like that. But too few people actually check for content. Maybe it's because they don't know how to check for content. If you're interested in a video about how to do that, kind of a checklist to get you started, please let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to put something together like that for you. But I just can't stress enough how much editing for content makes a difference. If you go back and notice that you have some of that meaningless dialogue, you can take it out and you can either replace it with something that's much more meaty and important, or you can just get rid of it and streamline your whole story. Editing for content is the best thing that you can do for your writing. Of course, it's easy to think that when you first write something down, it's beautiful, it's golden, I'm sure it has a lot of potential, that's awesome, but if you are serious about wanting to be a writer and wanting to grow, and you should want to grow even if you don't want to be a full-time author someday, then go back, edit for content. How can you make the characters more intriguing? How can you make the plot points really stand out and hit on an emotional level? How can you describe things in a way that isn't generic, but instead grabs the senses of the reader and the imagination of the reader? So those are my 5 tips. I hope they were helpful for you. Again, this is a collaboration with Marisa Mohi. If you have not checked out her channel, definitely do so. Look at the link below. And as always, like this video if you like it, and I will see you next Monday. Bye.